Hello, everyone.
Hello. Just waiting to get sort of people joined up with us.
Hi.
Nice to see you all today on this grey February afternoon.
Yeah,
I hope I speak for many of us to say that I'm just glad that January was over. That was a very long month, wasn't it?
Definitely was.
It certainly was. We're coming to you from various bedrooms, kitchens, and ante-rooms all spread around the country. So I hope everyone is comfortable and well. It's just really good to be able to get together like this and talk about some of the things that hopefully we have a mutual interest in. We'll just wait a minute or two just to let people get hooked onto us, and then we'll kick off.
I completely agree with Veronica that January was relentless. Kept accidentally saying things like last year when I meant last week. Back in January, it just felt so long.
I know. I actually forgot how old I was at one point in January. I couldn't remember. I was thinking, crikey, I've lost a year, I've gained a year, I have no idea.
Gained 10 maybe.
Well, it's 4:01. Maybe we should just get kicked off, folks. Again, a warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us. I see people are still logging on, so let's just move on and hope that everyone stays with us. We have done a number of webinars, over the past months, particularly since the sort of initial lockdown. And it's just been great to have, some of these conversations that help us think about our work and just think about, the various areas that we can improve on. So I think in terms of an impact webinar, we've kind of presented in the past a sort of an overall framework, if you like, the methodology. We're, now that we're getting a bit longer in the tooth on the webinars, we're starting to delve into specific areas. So what we want to do is perhaps look at a bit more detail, because some of you have said that's what you'd like to do. But we'd love you to join with us. We wouldn't want to make this just all presentational on our part. So we'd love you to join with us and ask questions and maybe have comments. So if you have a comment to make, please raise a hand, put something into the chat function or whatever, and we'll try and pick that up. And also, we'll not be able to cover all the areas of impact methodology or impact issues today. So if there's an area you want to discuss or you'd like to cover in a future webinar with us, again, flag that up, and we'll certainly include that in our planning. We will be sending out information after today's webinar, including the slides, so you can relax around. Obviously, maybe take your own notes, but you can relax around that. So let's get started. Next slide. So we're good to go, and let's just look at the kind of structure of our time with you this afternoon. There'll be a bit of introductions from ourselves, and then we'll what we said we'd do today is really look at areas that might be problematic, or look at areas that can go really well if you do them right, that kind of thing. So we're not just going to talk impact to you, but something of our experiences together as a group of people. So next slide, please. You will be really familiar with this if you've been with us before, but if not, here it is. We're really proud of the fact that in the Charity Finance Audit Survey, we've won awards for overall service. You can see we've over 700 charity clients, and we're part of a global network. So Moore Kingston Smith has been trying to forge ahead in the field of services to charities. Next slide. This is our team. So there's 7 of us. And actually, we're really quite happy about this mixture of skills. You can see the 3 of us there who comprise the impact team. Down on the left-hand side, the first guy you see there, Mark Solway's our managing director. He leads our team. We've got Marcus, and we've got our awesome fundraising colleagues, Dan and Emma. But it's the mixture of this skill base, really, that we think is really useful to the charities and to the clients that we come across.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to quickly tell you, I'm Penny, and I'm just going to very quickly tell you about our Twitter handle. So this is our Twitter handle in front of you, at MKSF Consulting, and please do join us in the conversation, obviously online, as Carl's mentioned, putting things in the chat. But if you'd also like to engage with us online, then you can just use this hashtag MKSFM Let's Talk. And very quickly as well, we've got lots of bits and pieces coming up. This slide will feature at the end as well, so don't worry about jotting this all down. But we've got a couple of webinars coming up in the next month, as you can see, and then 3 training days. So we've launched our spring training program, where we have half-day training workshops in March, April, and May, and those are finance, fundraising, and impact as well. In the email, the follow-up email, you'll get all of this and the information, which gives more details and how to book and things like that. Right, I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second.
So yeah, I think we were going to sort of kick things off really with a bit of a discussion, and we have some polls to start off with, which I'll just get going, and people can be kind of filling those out whilst Carl's saying a few words. So these polls are really trying to get people to kind of think about what we phrased it as slightly religious terminology here, but what's your devil when it comes to measuring impact, and what's your angel when it comes to measuring impact? So it's really just to get your kind of thoughts and ideas on what you kind of enjoy doing, or what you find kind of straightforward and enjoyable, and you know, what's your least favorite thing. So I'll just launch those polls while we're talking between ourselves. There we go, that's the first one. Oh, interesting. All the votes are coming fast, so we're up to 80 of you now have voted. Just let it go for another couple of minutes. All right, we've got over 80% of you voted, which I think is pretty good for stakeholder engagement. So I'll end that now and we can see the results. So there we go. It looks like knowing what data to collect is something that a lot of people feel kind of less than confident with, which I think is really interesting. And some of the slides that we'll be talking about today will kind of cover that. So that's good to know. And in fact, our training about building up an impact measurement framework is good to know on that as well. But it is difficult when there's so much stuff out there to know which bits are really, really important for you and which bits are less important. So that's really interesting. And then I'll just quickly do what your angel is as well, because it's the same set of answers. So let's see what people think about angel.
Helen, just to check, are you stopping and sharing it with the attendees? I can't see.
Yes, I shared the results. Yes, awesome. Yeah.
That's great. Sorry, I can't see that from my screen because I'm a panelist. Shirley, the poll should be coming up in front of you. Apologies if it's not.
Okay, interesting. So we've got slightly different answers this time. And let's share that then. So this time around, it's communicating your impact. I think that's really positive to know. There's clearly, you know, a lot of people out there who feel quite kind of passionate about their impact, and maybe that's why you enjoy communicating it. But as I said, these first kind of few minutes are really about us talking about impact and the difficult things and the things that we enjoy doing. So please, if you have any kind of tips or any explanation as to why you answered around your devil and your angel, then please do kind of put them in the chat and the Q&A, and we can really get stuff kicking off. But Carl, I'll hand.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, we've still got that up on our screen. Well, what we thought we'd do, folks, is just have a chat among ourselves, just to get a feel of our relative experience. And we thought we'd just maybe do a quick sort of kind of interview style, just to talk about stuff. So I'm going to light on Helen immediately, and I'm going to say, Helen, you've been around Impact for a while, for some years, in a couple of different roles. You're the Deputy Director of our amazing Impact team. How did you end up here?
It's a good question, Carl. Yeah, I feel like we should all have a cup of cocoa and a bonfire or something. So my background's actually sort of scientific. I did science at uni. It was something I was always very interested in, but I've also done a lot of kind of volunteering and always wanted a job in the third sector as well. And impact in terms of kind of putting those things together, understanding and measuring how effective things are, combined with kind of trying to really crack the nut of how to help people and how to demonstrate that you're helping people, just seemed like a very natural fit. So yeah, that's kind of how I've ended up in impact measurement. I think there's something kind of interesting about actually impact measurement. How scientific can it be? Things like well-being, you know, very subjective. So actually there's a lot of nuance in there, but that's really the kind of background that I came from.
And in the theme of today, where we're sort of looking at potential problem areas or challenges, is there an area, one or two ideas where you've found particular challenge?
Yeah, so it's interesting doing a bit of reflection on this before the webinar, and I think stakeholder engagement for me is something that's one of the most challenging things, but also in some ways one of the easiest things. So I think in terms of talking to your stakeholders from a kind of easy perspective, maybe a lot of people are very interested and eager to talk about their experience. You know, there's that kind of cliche about people's favorite thing to talk about is themselves at the end of the day. And I think if you can approach your stakeholders with this sort of open perspective and explain the value of participating and things like that, you can often have really, really valuable conversations. However, it can also be difficult because I think a lot of stakeholders are used to filling out kind of customer service style questionnaires, and a lot of impact measurement is about really getting people to reflect on what's changed for them, so what outcomes they've experienced. And I think that's a sort of a slightly deeper level of reflection for people that they might not necessarily be that used to. So it kind of requires maybe a bit of kind of more rapport building and things like that. Yeah, so I think stakeholder engagement is always a kind of really interesting part of impact.
Helen, you and I started to work at, as it was then, Kingston Smith, but we've got a third member of the impact team now, Penny. Penny, you came halfway across the world to join this impact team. Tell us a bit about that.
I did indeed, and in January I was definitely questioning that decision. So yeah, I sort of was back home a few years ago working in South Africa and sort of connecting funders to charitable projects. And one of the big questions for me was to ask to think about and to really try and uncover what are the projects, charitable projects that are really effective. And some of the things that one can do is sort of run due diligence on their governance procedures and their financials, and you can get sort of an idea from staff and case studies, and lots of charities have statistics on how many people they're helping, and all that stuff is really useful. But I found it wasn't getting to the crux of the matter and really answering the question, which is, what is the impact they're having? And I see Christopher's put a question in the chat, which is interesting. What does impact actually mean? And for me, it's what is the difference? What is the actual difference that your intervention or project is having, and what change is it creating for the communities and the people that you serve? So that's sort of, on my quest to answer that question, that sort of led me into discovering this world of impact measurement.
Okay, and you've done some projects while you've been at Moore Kingston Smith the last couple of years. Is there something sticks in your mind that worked out really well, or something you particularly enjoyed, some aspect of the impact work?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, similar to what Helen said, the stakeholder engagement can be tricky, but I would say that's sort of a really, really enjoyable part of it. It's just sort of speaking to people can be really inspiring, and hearing their stories. So that's definitely sort of, I can say, my favorite part of my job, as it were.
Great. Yeah. Okay. I was having just some, I've asked my colleagues some questions, so I was thinking, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't ask myself some questions, but I was just having some reflections on my experience of impact stuff. And what strikes me after some years experience and really looking back at it, you can make it really complex, or it can seem really complex if you allow it to be. So if you think of the skill sets that might be involved in someone who is really seriously tackling impact measurement, that you need some research skills, perhaps. I think you certainly need people skills for the stakeholder engagement my colleagues have been talking about. You probably need some vision to think, through how you go about actually fully taking on an impact project. Then there's planning skills, there's IT skills. You could talk yourself out of it very handily. So one of the things that occurs to me just looking back on sort of some years of experience is that there's something about just start, just get on and do it, which is a really kind of useful motivator to get going. And when we're talking to potential colleagues or potential clients, we often start with the whole question around what's the difference between, say, outputs and outcomes. Something that sounds really simple, but can actually be, quite detailed when you get into it. And I was thinking, because we have kind of come from, in many senses, we've come from a social return on investment background, and that can be, quite a piece of work to do. But I think also one of the good things about thinking about impact measurement is just trying to reflect on where it is you want to get to on your journey once you've got some impact measurement done. And yeah, you can go the whole hog and have a return on investment number. And that involves some complexity around thinking about putting values and outcomes, having a framework to gather those. But recently we have also been doing work with some clients that really wanted to inform in a more general sense whether or not they were creating some sort of impact, higher impact or perhaps lower impact around certain initiatives they were carrying out. And so there's a possibility of thinking how you go about having an indicative approach to your impact measurement. And this all boils down to how robust the data is that you have. Do you have data already, or do you have to go about getting data and gathering data? And so there's just something about remembering, I think, that when you get your impact measurement done in whatever form it takes, where is it that you want to go after that? What is it that piece of work should be informing. And most often for us, it's not a report that you then put on a shelf and say, there's our impact report. It's much more about saying, what does this inform in terms of the next steps we take? You know, is there a strategic aspect to what we've learned from our impact work? So, you know, the message here is, don't let the complexity overwhelm you. Start somewhere and begin simply. And we're going to look at some of the aspects of doing that. So I think we should move on. And in the spirit of what we're trying to do today, we're going to look at just a few aspects. Helen's going to take us through some things that perhaps people worry about when they think about measuring impact.
We've got a couple of questions already, Carl. I don't know. Should we have a chat about them before we go?
Yeah, I certainly don't mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got quite an interesting one from Leanne here, actually, who's asked whether there are any environmental charities on the call, and says that impacts in this area can be challenging in terms of what to measure. So I think that's really interesting. And if anyone fancies kind of raising their hand or putting anything in the chat, that would be interesting. And Leanne, if you wanted, I could always sort of unmute you as well, and we could maybe have a bit of a conversation about that, because I think that's a really interesting area. And then we also have a question from Will too. So Will says, I love Jeremy Nichols's keynote session on impact reporting at the recent ICAEW virtual charity conference, especially the need for accountability to beneficiaries and others. Do you think that we should or could move to a point where we get impact reports audited? So, Will, I think this is a fascinating question, and Jeremy Nichols, you know, is someone who is sort of quite well known in the field of impact reporting. He used to be chief executive of Social Value International, which coincidentally Carl and I used to work for. And I think it's a really interesting question. You know, often the perspective that Jeremy comes at these things is we have financial value and we're collecting information about financial value, and we need to audit those accounts in order to hold those kind of companies accountable for what they're doing. Why aren't we doing the same as charities, and why aren't we auditing social value accounts if we hold financial value to this kind of line? And I think that's a fascinating topic, and Social Value International have done a lot of kind of campaigning around the auditing of impact reports. And Carl, actually, in his role there, you helped set up the assurance service, didn't you, Carl? So I think in an ideal world, really, if we're going to be truly held accountable, then I think that should be the direction that we're heading in. But goodness knows how long as a sector that will take us. And one of the other things that's sometimes said about impact reporting, social impact reporting, is financial accounting has had like centuries and centuries to develop as a practice. We've had at most a couple of decades, and so you know, it is probably going to take a fair amount of time. But I definitely think if we're going to hold social value to the same kind of standard as financial value, then that's really where we should be headed. We have a few more questions. So Nanette has asked whether there are any lawyer organisations on the call. How do we make qualitative outcomes more understandable for donors and supporters, as opposed to construction projects where items can be counted? And how do we justify value for money? Has anyone responded about, oh, we have some stuff in the chat about environmental charities. That's good to see.
Someone, so Keely from Essex Wildlife Trust says she's happy to chat offline. I think that was obviously in response to Leanne, but I think it was just sent to us, so just to make sure that you two both connect.
We could facilitate that, couldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure we can.
I'm just wondering, should we, do you want to maybe to get started on some of the slides, and then we can come back to some of these questions. What do you think?
Yes, folks, we'll try and make sure we have 5 or 10 minutes at the end just to gather up any further questions. We'll certainly do that.
Okay. I'm just going to move us on. There we go.
Okay, so sorry, I got really interested in the chat then. There's lots of really interesting conversation going. So I've got a few slides now where I'm just going to quickly go through what people tend to worry about when measuring impact. And I think maybe some of this might sort of touch a nerve with some of you when we were doing the polls before. So if we look on the next slide, this slide is really all about how to know where to start. And it's really kind of important for us because we often kind of see that scoping something can really be the make or break for an impact project. So it's really important, as Carl said, it's good to just get started, and what you don't want to do is cast your net too widely and end up trying to kind of bite off more than you can chew, basically. So one of the important sort of considerations is to know where to start, and some of these questions should help you to kind of understand that. So there might be something about which project is the most important for you. Are you going to be applying for some more funding at some point soon, or is it something very strategically important that you're thinking about moving into? So that might be one of the considerations. Which project are you already collecting impact data on? Something about the strategy, or sometimes it's which project might be the easiest to collect impact data on. So we want to kind of pick those low-hanging fruit almost to begin with, so that you can kind of move on from there, learn from what you're doing, and then maybe apply that learning to something more difficult. So on this slide, you can see once you've kind of decided which activity you're thinking about measuring the impact of, again, we kind of need to go through a bit of a cycle to try and ask ourselves a few questions about, okay, well, where do we start with this activity? And you can kind of see there's a bit of a sort of iterative cycle here. So which activity are you choosing? Next off, who are the stakeholders affected? So who are the beneficiaries? And there'll be your direct beneficiaries, but there might also be loved ones. There might also be partners that you work with that benefit from that. And then how are they likely to change? So what are the outcomes that are likely to be happening for them? How are you going to measure that? And next, how are you going to engage with these stakeholders? So those are some kind of areas to start, which you would want to consider before you kind of start off on a project, because the danger with this is that you start off all guns blazing, you go for it, and then you kind of bite off more than you can chew. And we've sometimes spoken to people where there's become a sort of almost an organizational cultural reluctance about impact. It becomes something where someone mentions it in a meeting and there's a sort of a bit of an awkward silence because everyone remembers how the last project went or whatever. So it's useful to start with those questions and try and kind of make a good go of it. The next slide is about how you measure long-term outcomes. So I just like this picture of a crystal ball because it made me feel very calm. So it is all about kind of gazing into your crystal ball and thinking, how am I going to measure the long-term outcomes that arise as a result of our work? And this is common sometimes to educational interventions, or maybe a healthcare intervention, sometimes advocacy. You know, if what you're planning to, the change that you're planning to create is going to happen a few years down the line, how can you kind of measure that when you're at the start of that journey? So on the next slide, we've got a bit of an example that I'll talk through here. So this is an example of an outcome for older people in a community dance project. And we've got the fact that they're participating in the dance project. So older people are increasing their levels of physical activity, resulting in an increased level of fitness at the end of the project. We've got a bit of a menu up there. So could we get rid of that, Penny? There we go. So increased engagement with physical activity more widely, and then the long-term outcome here is reduced risk of dementia. But as I said, the challenge is how can you kind of measure that from your sort of community dance project point of view. So if we click once, you can measure before and after of the fitness. You know, it might be to do with heart rate, it might be to do with how long they can walk around the block or whatever. The next outcome, think about ways to measure that. But how do we measure this reduced risk of dementia? And really the key for this question is about triangulation with other evidence. So there are sort of some examples of some papers out there and some kind of fairly robust academic research that can draw a good causal link between your sort of intermediate outcomes and your long-term outcomes that you can use to kind of inform and evidence and back up what you're claiming. So that's one approach that you could take to kind of measuring and trying to understand how what you're doing is resulting in these long-term outcomes. And then finally, engaging with stakeholders. So one of the questions a lot of people have is, how do I engage with stakeholders across the board rather than just the usual subjects, the usual suspects? So, you know, the people who you've already got case studies on and who really love to respond to all the surveys, how do you kind of go beyond them? And the same kind of angle is, how do you avoid survey or engagement fatigue amongst stakeholders? I'm sure we all know what that feels like. So the next slide has some ways potentially that you might be able to think around this. So firstly, think about the points at which the people that you're engaging with are already sort of engaging with your service. So that might be through a parents' evening, it might be just after a session that you've held with them, it might be a kind of Christmas party or something at the end of the year. There are touch points at which stakeholders will come into contact with your service, which you could kind of really capitalize on. And that might be an opportunity to try and catch more people who don't usually necessarily kind of engage more formally with you. Secondly, audit your current engagement activity. So are all of the questions that you're asking in all your surveys really necessary? Are there any that you just don't really use the data from? Could you take off any of those questions and add in some questions that really think about things a bit more deeply? And there's a few other points there as well, especially the last one, considering the approach that you're using. If that's appropriate for the people that you're trying to speak to, maybe a phone call is better than an online focus group and so on. So there's a few kind of different ways there to really try and reimagine your stakeholder engagement. So you're trying to kind of cast a wider net, basically.
Hi again, everyone. Thanks, Helen. That's some really useful pointers there. So I'm just going to go through a few areas, the things that sort of I've found that initially they can be quite difficult or overwhelming, but they are easier than you think if you get them right. So hopefully there's some tips here, and that might be helpful in responding to some of the comments in the chats that I saw earlier. So the first one here is, sometimes it doesn't want to move on. I have to use, there we go. So the first sort of element is measuring amount of change. I saw that someone was asking about measuring change earlier. And we might sort of know that a certain outcome exists or is being experienced rather by your stakeholders. So let's use a qualitative example, because again, somebody was asking about qualitative outcomes and how do you make them sort of understandable. So hopefully these next couple of slides will help. So you've got confidence and you know that that this is something that your stakeholders or your service users are experiencing. Knowing how much of this outcome they are experiencing because of your intervention is really useful and really helpful. And it's helpful for a few reasons, which I've sort of put on the slide. The one is that it can really reveal how your intervention is taking effect over time and helping you to give a before and after view of change. So, you know, if you measure, for example, when sort of you get baseline data in, so when people sort of start on the intervention, and then at the end you can really see the distance traveled between beginning and end. And also sometimes organizations like to measure sort of partway through, so then you can get a real feel for how is sort of your stakeholders growing in that outcome, as it were, over time. And obviously very useful when it comes to valuing outcomes. I know sort of talking about putting a value on outcomes or putting a financial proxy on outcomes is a hot topic. So that can be very useful if you know how much change has taken place, and then reporting on your impact as well. So articulating and demonstrating your impact and having this evidence. And we often talk about the importance of evidence. So if we want to be able to measure the amount of change, how do we actually measure quantity of change? So this is something, a really sort of straightforward, simple rather example of something that we would use in a survey. So it's quite a simple Likert scale, and on the top row you'll see sort of strongly disagree to strongly agree, and on the left hand side are the outcomes. So obviously you would have had to do some sort of preliminary work and engagement to find out what those outcomes are. And then send this out to your stakeholders, and they can respond back. So this example here would be, you know, a project that was around, say, health and fitness, and some outcomes around feeling less anxious about health, or feeling that their fitness and physical health has improved. The next one is a big topic, and I won't have time now to go into the sort of real nitty gritty of it, but it's the counterfactual, and often actually this is missed out. I think people sort of don't, it's a little bit of too hard basket. And the counterfactual is really important because it helps us to understand how much of the change you're creating is actually down to you. So this in pink here in the box, this is our sort of definition of change. Impact is the value. This is the definition of impact, is the value of the change that's attributable to you. And that last part, when we measure the counterfactual, it really helps us get a grasp on what is attributable to you. And we don't want to overclaim our impact. If you're familiar with the 7 principles, and if you're not, just sort of pop into Google and find Social Value UK or Social Value International, and you can see the 7 principles of social value, and one of them is not overclaiming. So we don't want to sort of say that we're creating all this change when actually we're only creating some of it. And it also can help us to think strategically, asking these questions and finding out about our counterfactual, because, you know, why would we continue investing in creating an outcome if it would have happened anyway, or if perhaps it's mostly not really down to us. So how do we actually measure the counterfactual? Before we go on to that, I have an example of sort of what we do. Let's just quickly sort of think about what it means. And we've got 2 elements here, which is dead weight and attribution. I know somebody put in the chat earlier as well that the terminology and the language is really terrifying. And I can definitely, I know exactly what you mean. When I was first introduced to all of these, they are, but the concepts, if we really break them down, are relatively simple. So dead weight is what would have happened anyway. So if your stakeholders, your service users weren't taking part in your intervention, or if your intervention didn't exist, would these changes have happened anyway? Would they be doing something very similar? And attribution is, are the other agencies or other things in the lives of your stakeholders that are contributing to that change? So with the example of confidence, you know, maybe they are increasing in confidence, but there might be other things that they're doing that's also helping to contribute to that outcome being created. So those are 2 elements of counterfactual that we really want to try and get an idea of what they are. And the way that we do this is we try and the way that we gauge it is to try and get a percentage for both of those elements. So we try and get a percentage of what would have happened anyway, and how much of the change is down to other agencies. So these are just examples of the types of questions that we often sort of pose to stakeholders when we're running engagements and we're gathering data. And just sort of starting off that conversation and saying to participants, whether you're in a focus group or in interviews, you know, what do you think might have happened anyway if you hadn't been involved in this program, or if this program didn't exist. And it's a fascinating question to ask and to hear the responses. So just sort of to bring it to life and hopefully help it to make a bit more sense. I've been recently involved in a project that's working with young people, young children, sort of sports and activities and an exercise program on a Saturday morning. And when I asked this question to families, the responses were quite varied. So when I said, you know, if you weren't coming to this Saturday morning activity, what might have happened anyway? And some families said, well, you know, we're very active as a family, and we'd probably be down the road, you know, going to the Lido and swimming, or going down the road to another sort of sporting event or sporting club. So for them, you know, the dead weight might be sort of higher up the scale, so more sort of 75 or 80%, because quite a lot of the changes would have happened anyway. But for other families, they said, you know, if we weren't coming to this on a Saturday morning, we'd be at home, probably still in bed, you know, might just be watching telly, the kids might just be watching telly. So for them, the changes that they were being experienced, the dead weight would be very low, so only sort of a small amount, or if any, of the change would be happening for them. So sort of asking this and getting these conversations going, and then sort of once you've asked your sample, you can come up with a good idea of what's a value that you feel represents your population. So this last thing I'm going to talk about is stakeholder engagement. And rather than sort of talk through what stakeholder engagement is, a lot of you said actually that stakeholder engagement is one of your angels. So that's great. So you obviously, a lot of you are sort of communicating and talking to your stakeholders about change. But I thought I'd just give an example of when, for me, stakeholder engagement hasn't gone so well, and then my reflection on that and sort of what I've sort of put in place to make sure it has gone well since then. So a few years ago, was running telephone interviews for a project, and started off the telephone interview, and it went well in the sense that the person was talking and really telling me everything about, you know, their thoughts and their feelings and what they enjoyed and what they didn't enjoy about the charity, etc. But at the end of it, I realized I had very, very little useful data, and I didn't have outcomes data. So, which is, you know, really what we need in impact measurement. You know, I didn't have an understanding of how this intervention had actually changed this person's life. I just sort of had their feelings, and I had these ideas on all the different aspects of the charity, including their views on management and whatnot. And then I realized that the reason was because I hadn't been clear at the start of exactly what was sort of the context and what was the purpose of the phone call, and what activity we were really drilling down into. And whilst it seems, you know, really quite simple, often when we're doing impact measurement, you know, we're focusing in on one activity. It's a lot easier to focus in on one activity at a time rather than just go and measure the impact of the whole charity. And so I hadn't sort of put that in context. And since then, you know, what we do is, which is really useful, is sort of making that very clear, and then getting those first few minutes for the participant to sort of reflect on what they actually do in that activity. And then once they say, you know, on the Saturday morning, we do this and we do this and we do this. And then once you sort of, that lays the base, that really leads on nicely to the next question, which is, okay, now you've got that in your mind and you've got those memories. What is the change that's created? You know, how does this activity change your life? You know, what is the change that it brings about for you? So that was sort of an example of where things maybe haven't gone so well initially, but what we've put in place. So I think that's me for now. I'm going to hand over to Carl.
Hello, so it's back to me. So I'm just going to maybe look at some other elements and issues very quickly, because we're coming up to 4:45, and we did say we wanted to leave some time for questions. So if we can just go to the next slide. People often use the term metrics in impact measurement. And, you know, one of the things that we will want to do is just think what might we mean by some of those things. But just finishing off on stakeholder engagement, have you ever asked yourself why we're getting close to stakeholders? I mean, why is that really important? And I mean, I think one of the things that occurs to me is that it's the surefire way to make sure that you're not getting into a drift away from your mission. So if you can get close to stakeholders, know that you're doing the things that meet needs in terms of the changes your activity brings about for them, then you're in a position where you're either deciding those needs are really important, we'll continue that piece of work. And that especially works if you're commissioned to meet those needs. So if you put all those things together in terms of your aims and mission, staying close to stakeholders to check that the work you're doing is actually meeting needs, and that could be more than one group of stakeholders, by the way, then you're getting to the point where I think that synergy actually means that there's far more chance that your organization will enjoy future sustainability. There's also spin-offs in this type of work as well, because you might find that there's new needs or a new stakeholder group that you really feel you should be working with. I mentioned about metrics, and it's a bit of a vague term actually. Let's look at a couple of the areas that we need to talk about. Certainly if you're going to be serious about impact measurement, you need to think about actually measuring change. People often confuse indicators like the outcome star as the thing that measures impact. For us, as Penny said, and for, I think it was Chris who asked the question, what do you actually mean by impact? There's a difference between measuring the amount of change and the value of that change then being looked at in terms of how much of that change you're responsible for. We would see that as impact, as Penny has said. But this outcome star approach can be very useful in terms of looking at distance traveled. So one of the things you need to think about if you're going to do an evaluative piece of impact measurement is actually what are the indicators that we can use to actually evidence the change we're claiming. Another area is how many people experience change. So another metric, if you like, in quotes, is that whole area of, you know, how many people in a particular group actually experience that change. And equally important, what happens to those that don't experience that particular change? And then finally on this slide, once you get to that point, then you're in a position to actually think about the value of the change. So indicators, I think, are one of the most important areas that I touched on just there, because one of the things I've learned down the years is that many impact reports claim change, but there's quite a high proportion of them don't actually give you any evidence for where that claim of change has taken part. So has taken place. So this area of indicators is really quite important, and particularly for evaluative work. So sometimes it's important that you have the data, and so therefore it's already there. It may well be that you need to look for the data, and then there's issues about whether or not the indicator can be observed, or it's something that's self-reported. I think there's a final point missing there. That's it. Thanks, Penny. So, you know, indicators can be objective or subjective, can be self-reported, or it might be something that somebody objectively observes. But really important to sort of get those in place when you're thinking about planning a piece. Last few slides are going to just touch on data. And I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to go even more quickly through these. So one of the things you really need to do is to think about what data you need. And, you know, it's important to think design. We're ready to move on to the next slide. It's important to really think design when you're thinking about a piece of work that you're going to do. And there's nothing really that needs to bamboozle us when we think of how we gather data and impact measurement. But things like being careful about generalizations from a small sample. Make sure we don't confuse initial stakeholder engagement to get an idea of what the group feels is changing, confusing that with a later data collection phase if you have to do a piece of research to follow up a much bigger group. And always remember that the risk of positive bias is always there, because you will rarely look on the negative side in terms of benefits. And we've said for a long time now that any good impact reporting mechanism worth its salt will also look at the potential for negative change taking place. Next slide. So remember, when you're thinking about quantitative or qualitative data, the quantitative stuff is really important as well, but it gives you an insight into the amount of change. But it's really important that you establish the nature of change first. Just be really aware that when you're talking to stakeholder groups, for example, we've touched on that quite a lot today, that the group you're talking with is a reasonable representation of the wider group, and you can check that out by just knowing, your stakeholder group. In recent years, there's been quite a lot of work done around forecasted reports or predictive analyses, and essentially the attraction of these is that you can get on and start to think about outcomes and start to create a framework to measure impact and gather the data as you go along. So really it moves from a predictive analysis right through to something where once you've gathered the data after a few iterations of the service, if you like, you get to a point where the data is reasonably robust. And finally, any claims that you make around your impact should be, should draw from the best evidence that you can get your hands on. And so that might be internal stuff. It might be primary data from talking to stakeholder groups, or there may be external research that's available for similar circumstances to the work you're doing. So it's always good to think about how you can triangulate that data. So, I mean, one of the big issues for us is the data good enough? Does the data lead you to the evidence that you want? Can you make the assertions that you're really keen to make in terms of claiming the outcomes that you create for your beneficiaries? And where does that take you in relation to strategy? So I hope that's been useful. We've tried to keep faith with what we set out to do. We've talked about a few areas. We've tried to also say where, there's some of these areas are challenging and you really need to look at them. But I think we're nearly at the end of our sort of presentation part of the webinar, and maybe we could ask you for questions or tackle some of the questions we've got in front of us.
Yeah, so we have had quite a few questions in the chat, so thanks everyone. It's probably also worth saying that we're all kind of available afterwards, and we do a sort of a free half-hour consultation with people. So just a kind of no strings attached phone call. If you'd like to chat through any of this through, then please just drop us a note, and we can have a chat on the phone, no problem at all. So I think one of the earliest questions in the chat actually that we haven't kind of had a chance to get to is from Jacqueline, and she's asked what's the best way to engage stakeholders or beneficiaries that do not have formal literacy in impact reports. And I think that's a really important question, Jacqueline, because we need to kind of make sure that whatever we're doing is accessible for stakeholders, whether that's because English is a second language, or if people have kind of access requirements or disabilities, then I think that's a really important part of what impact is. It's about holding your organisation to account. So my recommendation there is to basically kind of think about how easy it is to communicate with them. What's the best way to communicate with them? And if it's through talking through a set of slides in a very kind of easily accessible language, it might be that, you know, the House of Parliament do kind of easy read versions of lots of their reports and things, so that could be kind of quite a good area to get some ideas from. But basically try and present things in a language and a form that they can understand, and a lot of outcomes can be represented in a very complicated way, or if it's about well-being, it might be to do with feeling better, feeling happier, you know, trying to search for other language that makes sure that people kind of feel included and part of your organization. The next one, I'll ask you this, either Penny or Carl. So we've got one about, would you usually recommend agreeing a theory of change at the start of a project to then guide later evaluation or impact measurement work? That's from Julia.
I was just looking at that one, Helen. So if you'd not said anything, I would have jumped in and said there's a question from Julia. In the old impact framework approach, Julia, we used to talk about intended change. So in other words, before you came to the point where you identified a stakeholder and you tried to decide the outcomes that you would link to that stakeholder, before you went and got the evidence for those changes, we used to talk about, well, what do we think will happen, or what will be, you know, what is the intended change that we want to bring about as a result of this activity? Now, subsequent to that, some of our colleagues in the field of impact measurement got into the theory of change stuff, and I think it can be really useful to think around, you know, what are the things that we feel we would like to change. As long as you keep in mind that that's the hypothesis, which you then still need to test. I've seen quite a bit of organizations creating policy for themselves out of a result of something that remained a hypothesis. And I think that's the weakness of theory of change used in this sense. I've seen other great theory of change work which helps organizations really think through what it is their mission is about. But at the back end of any theory of change should be and so what is the reality? What is the test of what we're really changing? And one of the kind of approaches to the analysis of outcomes is this whole area of thinking, what change did we intend that would come about? Was there any unintended change? Because if you think about it, if you can identify unintended change, that's a rich vein of social value, because it's something you won't have accounted for before, just by virtue of the fact that it was unintended in the case of your work. So the short answer to your question, Julie, is yes. It's a real good exercise internally to think, what is it that we're trying to bring about, but always follow through and check out in an impact analysis, what are the outcomes, what are the intended, unintended outcomes, and potentially also, as we've mentioned, what are the negative outcomes.
I thought I'd pick up on a question. Sorry, I haven't been following it because I was sharing the slides. So I just seen a question from Paul that I'm happy to have a stab at answering, unless there's other ones before, Helen, you want to. But we will get back to all the questions.
We will, yes. We'll send emails out to those we don't address.
Yeah, we've got personal emails from us. So Paul's asked a really good question around, should we be open about negative or less positive impacts? And are there many examples where charities report this? And I think that's a really, really good question, because I think, you know, we find that charities, you know, if they hear or if they see negative impacts, they're obviously often their first port of call is to be perhaps defensive around it. And actually measuring those negative outcomes, we absolutely would say yes is really crucial, because if you are creating and Carl just talked about unintended, obviously it's going to be an unintended change. You would never intend to create a negative change, but being aware of those, and we've seen them in the work that we do, is so important and really powerful for charities, because what you can do then is it might just be, once you've been made aware of that, it might just be quite a small change or tweak that you need to make to your activity to actually, you know, mitigate that, and then they are not experiencing that negative change, or perhaps experiencing a lot less of it, and then your overall social value is naturally immediately increased. And as I said, often they're just sort of small things that you need to do. So absolutely, we would encourage you to be open to measuring negative changes. And just to sort of address the second part of it, are the examples where charities report this. You know, nobody's really going to put that on their PR and put that, you know, put that on the front page of their social media and say, you know, we found this. But from that point of view, I think, you know, measuring those changes and measuring that those negative changes are really important for you strategically. So, you know, I think hopefully that sort of answers your question. I don't know if Helen or Carl wants to add to that.
There is, I think the best example I've seen of the negative side is Click Sargent did an impact report called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And they really did explicitly, they said what they'd done well that year, they said that what they'd done badly that year, and said how they would improve it. And then the ugly was about how the changing context had affected kind of their stakeholders and the kind of upcoming issues in this sort of more community context that they needed to tackle. But that impact report is worth taking a look at, because it is just so impressive in terms of its accountability, and it, you know, it presents what they've done badly but in a positive way, because it shows that they're being transparent about it. Yes, and maybe that's a good note to end on, transparency, because it's 1 minute past 5, so we've slightly failed to be completely on time for you guys, but there was lots to talk about in that session, wasn't there?
There was, and we've come to the end. We will really, if you've asked a question and we haven't addressed it here, we will be able to save these, and we will go through them and come back to you, if we may, with our thoughts. It may not be the complete answer, but we'll do our best to answer anything you've raised. And do, as my colleagues have said, do please feel free to get in touch with us just to talk about some of these things. Lift the phone to us. You know, 10 minutes on the phone costs nothing from our point of view, and we'd be delighted to talk to you. So it's 2 minutes past 5. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish you a very nice evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Take care.